This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. The desert sun blazed relentlessly over the dusty town of Red Mesa, Arizona, casting long shadows over Desert Pines High School, a building that seemed as worn and exhausted as its aging faculty. Inside its fading walls, Mr. Howard Gable shuffled through the linoleum-floored hallways, clutching a stack of ungraded essays to his chest. The essays were crumpled at the edges, smeared with coffee stains, and marked by careless, half-hearted scrawls from students who barely cared about the subject he loved: history. To Mr. Gable, they were a reflection of his dwindling career, a reminder that he had become obsolete, much like the yellowed maps and outdated globes cluttering his classroom. At 63, Howard Gable was the oldest teacher at Desert Pines. His thinning white hair and a slight hunch gave him a fragile appearance, like a relic that had somehow survived the passage of time in a place that devoured the weak. His colleagues referred to him as kindly old Gable, though the nickname carried an undercurrent of pity rather than respect. To his students, however, he was nothing more than a joke, a punching bag for their adolescent cruelty. They mimicked his slow, deliberate walk, his trembling hands, and his soft, hesitant voice. In the age of viral videos and social media, their torment extended far beyond the classroom. Howard had once loved teaching. Decades ago, he had been full of passion, his lectures brimming with enthusiasm as he brought ancient battles and historical revolutions to life. But the years had not been kind. His energy faded, his students became increasingly unruly, and the administration began to view him as an inconvenient relic. He clung to his position out of necessity. Retirement was a luxury he couldn't afford, and perhaps out of pride, refusing to admit that the world had moved on without him. In recent years, the bullying had grown unbearable. The students of Desert Pines were an unruly, entitled group, emboldened by the anonymity of their online personas. They would snap photos of him mid-lecture, capturing unflattering angles to turn into memes. Videos of his trembling hands as he wrote on the chalkboard were edited with cruel captions and shared across the school's social media channels. Laughter often erupted in class. Not at his jokes; those had stopped years ago, but at the latest post mocking him. Howard's classroom had become a battleground. Every day he walked in expecting ridicule. His attempts to regain control were met with eye rolls, exaggerated yawns, and whispered insults. Even the good students, those who didn't actively participate in the bullying, didn't stand up for him. They sat silently, eyes fixed on their phones or their desks, unwilling to risk becoming targets themselves. The administration offered no help. Whenever Howard tried to report the behavior, he was met with polite but dismissive excuses. "Kids will be kids," the principal would say with a strained smile. "They're just testing boundaries. Try to be more engaging, maybe incorporate some technology into your lessons." It was advice that stung deeply, as if the blame for the students' cruelty rested on his inability to entertain them. Howard's home life offered no solace. He lived alone in a modest, cluttered house on the outskirts of town, a home that creaked and groaned in the desert winds. His only companion was a faded photograph of his late wife, Margaret, who had passed away nearly a decade ago. Her absence left a void he tried to fill with work, but even that had turned sour. Nights were long and lonely, spent grading papers under the dim light of a desk lamp that flickered ominously, as if it too were ready to give up. The final straw came on a Monday morning in November, a day that began like any other. The air was crisp and dry, the sky a pale blue streaked with the orange of dawn. Howard arrived early, as he always did, to prepare for his first period lecture. He had spent the weekend meticulously crafting a presentation on the Revolutionary War, hoping to ignite even a spark of interest in his students. But as he set up the projector, he noticed the uneasy hush that fell over the room. The students were grinning, their eyes darting toward their phones. A sense of foreboding washed over Howard, but he forced himself to ignore it, launching into his lecture with practiced determination. Minutes later, the projector screen flickered, and the slide he had painstakingly prepared was replaced by a video. At first, he didn't understand what he was seeing. His own face filled the screen, distorted and grotesque, with exaggerated features drawn crudely over it. A high-pitched, cartoonish voice mocked his words, mimicking his mannerisms in a way that drew roaring laughter from the class. The video had been edited with precision, blending clips of his lectures with scenes from slapstick comedies and derisive captions that labeled him a pathetic fossil. Howard froze, the blood draining from his face. The remote control slipped from his hand and clattered onto the floor. He stood there, paralyzed, as the laughter grew louder, more suffocating, filling every corner of the room like a noxious gas. When he finally turned to leave, The humiliation followed him, the sound of laughter echoing down the hallways, as he retreated to the sanctuary of the faculty lounge. That day, something inside Howard Gable broke. The ridicule he had endured for years, the loneliness of his existence, the indifference of his colleagues, all of it coalesced into a single overwhelming wave of despair and rage. He sat in the lounge, staring blankly at the chipped mug of coffee in his hands, as a seed of an idea began to take root. It was a dark, terrible idea, one that frightened him at first. But the more he thought about it, the more it seemed inevitable. By the time the bell rang to signal the end of the school day, Howard had made a decision. The humiliation would end. They would never laugh at him again. The days following the humiliating incident in Mr. Gable's classroom were a haze of seething rage and festering despair. He moved through the halls of Desert Pines High School like a ghost, his hunched shoulders and shuffling steps marking him as prey in a building ruled by predators. Laughter and whispers seemed to follow him everywhere, slipping around corners and slithering under doors. The video of his public disgrace had spread beyond the confines of the school. It now lived on the internet, where strangers piled onto the cruelty with comments and parodies of their own. His name became synonymous with mockery, his existence reduced to a punchline for the amusement of people who had never even met him. Every time he passed a group of students in the hallway, their laughter twisted the knife already lodged deep in his heart. It no longer mattered whether they were laughing at him or at something else entirely. The weight of his humiliation had grown so immense that it painted the world in shades of scorn. He began to avoid eye contact with everyone, even his colleagues. The other teachers, perhaps out of embarrassment or discomfort, kept their distance, offering only perfunctory greetings or polite nods. No one acknowledged the video, and no one asked how he was doing. Their silence was worse than the students' derision. It was a tacit acceptance of his suffering, a confirmation that he was alone. The isolation at home was no refuge. His small, cluttered house felt colder and darker than usual, the silence inside a deafening counterpoint to the chaos of his thoughts. The internet, once a lifeline to news and trivia that had distracted him from his loneliness, became a source of torment. He couldn't resist the urge to search for the video, to read the comments beneath it. Each cruel word, each mocking emoji, burned into his mind like a brand. Pathetic, creepy old man, how is this loser still teaching? The digital assault became a feedback loop of misery, his own masochistic curiosity ensuring he relived the worst moment of his life again and again. One night he sat at his kitchen table, under the dim glow of a flickering light bulb, staring at the laptop in front of him. His hands trembled as he scrolled through pages of comments. A cold cup of coffee sat forgotten beside him, the bitter dregs congealing at the bottom of the mug. His heart raced, his breath came in shallow gasps, and a cold sweat slicked his forehead. The comments weren't just mocking him, they were dissecting him, analyzing every weakness, every quirk, and every perceived failure with surgical precision. They knew him better than he knew himself, or so it seemed. The internet had turned him into a caricature, and there was nothing he could do to fight back. As he sat there, a memory surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome. It was from his first year of teaching, decades ago. He had been young, idealistic, and eager to make a difference. One of his students, a quiet boy with an awkward gait and a passion for history, had been bullied mercilessly by his classmates. Howard had intervened, pulling the boy aside and encouraging him to stand up for himself. "People only have power over you if you let them," he had said. Now, years later, the irony of his own advice struck him like a physical blow. He had let the world strip him of his dignity, his identity, and his will to fight back. He was no longer a teacher, he was a victim, and he hated himself for it. The breaking point came the following week during a routine faculty meeting. The principal, a middle-aged man with a perpetual air of exasperation, stood at the front of the room, droning on about budget cuts and test scores. Howard sat near the back, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, his mind elsewhere. He barely registered the words until the principal made an offhand comment about the importance of engaging students and adapting to modern teaching methods. The words, innocuous to anyone else in the room, struck Howard like a slap to the face. He felt the eyes of his colleagues turn toward him, some with pity, others with veiled amusement. The implication was clear: he was the problem. He was the dinosaur who refused to evolve. Something inside him snapped. He clenched his fists under the table, his nails digging into his palms until they left crescent-shaped imprints. His vision blurred, and a low ringing filled his ears. He excused himself from the meeting, mumbling something about not feeling well, and left the room before anyone could stop him. As he walked through the empty hallways, his mind churned with thoughts he couldn't control. Rage, humiliation, and despair coalesced into a single, overwhelming emotion that consumed him. For the first time in his life, Howard Gable felt capable of something monstrous. That night, he sat in his living room, staring at the blank screen of his television. The house was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, which cast long, eerie shadows across the room. He didn't bother turning on the lamp. In the dim light, he began to scribble on a notepad, the pen moving furiously across the paper. The words came unbidden, a stream of consciousness that spilled from his mind onto the page. At first, they were disjointed fragments of thoughts, memories, and emotions. But as the hours passed, a plan began to take shape. It was a terrible, unthinkable plan, one that would have horrified the man he once was. But the man he once was no longer existed. He spent the next few days in a daze, moving through the motions of teaching without really being present. The students' taunts seemed distant, as if they were coming from the other side of a thick pane of glass. He no longer cared what they said or did. His mind was consumed with his plan, each detail carefully considered and refined. He stopped eating, his clothes hung looser on his already gaunt frame, and dark circles appeared under his eyes. His colleagues noticed the change but said nothing. If they had, he might have been saved. But no one spoke up, and Howard Gable continued down his dark path, unchallenged and unseen. By the end of the week, he was ready. The humiliation he had endured was about to come to an end. They would pay for what they had done, and he would make sure they never forgot the name Howard Gable. Howard Gable's descent into darkness unfolded with an eerie precision, as though every misstep in his life had been leading him toward this moment. The humiliation, the loneliness, and the quiet rage had hollowed him out, leaving only a cold, calculating mind capable of focusing on one singular purpose. The plan did not come to him all at once. It evolved over weeks, growing more intricate and terrible as he worked through the details. His thoughts, once disorganized and plagued by doubt, became razor-sharp. Each step was meticulously plotted, each variable considered, and each possible outcome weighed. What began as a seed of revenge had blossomed into a fully realized nightmare. Howard knew that his actions would leave no room for redemption. This was not a cry for help or a desperate plea for understanding. It was a reckoning. The students who had tormented him would pay for their cruelty, and he would become the instrument of that justice. In his twisted logic, it wasn't murder, it was a lesson. A final, irrevocable lesson that they would never forget, even in death. The first step was selecting his targets. Not every student in his classes had actively bullied him, but Howard didn't distinguish between the aggressors and the bystanders. In his mind, their silence was complicity, and their laughter, even if only out of nervousness, was an unforgivable betrayal. He created a list of 20 names, each one written carefully in his trembling, spidery handwriting. He cross-referenced this list with the school's records, ensuring that all of them had similar schedules and could be gathered in one place without drawing suspicion. The list became his focus, a talisman that both fueled his rage and gave him a sense of purpose. Next, he studied the school itself. Desert Pines High was an old building, designed in the 1960s with little regard for modern safety standards. Its labyrinthine layout, outdated security system, and poorly maintained infrastructure made it the perfect stage for his plan. Howard had spent decades in the school. He knew its every creak and flaw. He knew which doors jammed, which cameras were broken, and which rooms were rarely used. He spent his free periods walking the halls, noting the placement of fire alarms, emergency exits, and ventilation ducts. To anyone watching, he appeared like an aging teacher lost in thought, his slow, meandering steps unremarkable. But in his mind, he was constructing a mental map, one that would guide him when the time came. He chose the school gymnasium as the site of his reckoning. It was large enough to contain all 20 of his targets, isolated from the rest of the building, and equipped with heavy doors that could be locked from the outside. The gym's soundproof walls, a feature meant to muffle the noise of basketball games and pep rallies, would ensure that no one outside would hear what was happening inside. He spent hours inside the gym after school, under the guise of preparing lesson plans or supervising non-existent after-school activities. During these times, he measured the dimensions of the room, tested the locks on the doors, and noted the position of the bleachers and storage closets. Every detail was committed to memory. The next phase involved gathering supplies. Howard was careful, methodical. He didn't want to attract attention or leave a paper trail that could lead back to him. He made small, unremarkable purchases at different stores across the town, a roll of duct tape here, a box of nails there. He raided the school's janitorial closet for cleaning chemicals, storing them in an old metal cabinet in his classroom. He even visited a hardware store on the outskirts of town, purchasing lengths of chain and padlocks. When asked by the cashier what he needed them for, he smiled weakly and mumbled something about securing his tools at home. The lie came easily, as though it were just another lecture he had rehearsed 100 times. As the days turned into weeks, Howard transformed his classroom into a workshop of horrors. After the students left for the day, he locked the door and worked late into the night, building crude but effective traps. A row of sharpened stakes hidden beneath a false floor panel. A makeshift smoke bomb cobbled together from household chemicals. He tested each device in secret, marveling at his own ingenuity. The work gave him a sense of control, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, he was the one in charge, the one holding all the power. His preparations extended beyond the physical. Howard understood the importance of psychological manipulation. He wanted his targets to feel the same helplessness and fear that he had endured. To achieve this, he crafted a narrative, one that would unfold like a grim theater production. He wrote a series of notes, each one addressed to a specific student, outlining their crimes in chilling detail. These notes were carefully worded, blending factual observations with venomous accusations. He left no room for ambiguity. They needed to know why this was happening to them. Finally, Howard needed a pretext to gather all 20 students in the gymnasium at the same time. He decided to disguise his plan as an after-school event for the History Club, a group that, ironically, none of the students on his list belonged to. He crafted a flyer advertising a special project that promised extra credit for participants. The project was deliberately vague, described only as a unique opportunity to engage with history in an interactive way. Howard printed the flyers in the school's computer lab and distributed them to his targets, slipping them into their lockers and placing them on their desks when no one was looking. The day of the event loomed closer, and Howard's demeanor shifted in subtle but noticeable ways. He became quieter, more withdrawn, his eyes shadowed with sleepless nights. He stopped eating, his already gaunt frame growing even thinner. His colleagues noticed the changes but chalked them up to stress or the natural decline of an aging man nearing retirement. None of them asked questions, and none of them intervened. Howard, in turn, felt a grim satisfaction at their indifference. It only confirmed what he already knew: he was invisible to the world. On the eve of the event, Howard stood in the center of the gymnasium, surveying the space one final time. The gym smelled faintly of sweat and floor polish, a familiar scent that reminded him of countless assemblies and sports games he had attended over the years. But tonight it felt different. The room was silent, its shadows deeper and more oppressive than usual. The bleachers loomed like rows of empty graves, and the dim overhead lights cast long, jagged shadows across the floor. It was perfect. Howard left the gym and returned to his classroom, where he sat at his desk and opened a leather-bound notebook. Inside, he had written a single sentence, a lesson they will never forget. Beneath it, he signed his name with deliberate care, the letters curling and looping like the final stroke of a masterpiece. He closed the notebook, placed it neatly in the center of the desk, and left the room without looking back. The plan was complete, and there was no turning back. The gymnasium at Desert Pines High School was eerily quiet, the faint hum of the overhead lights the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. Outside, the desert winds howled, rattling the loose windows and stirring the fine dust that clung to every surface. It was late evening, and the students had gathered for what they believed to be an extra credit history project. 20 of them, a mix of bullies and bystanders, filed into the gym with varying levels of curiosity and indifference. Some were smirking, whispering among themselves, while others scrolled absent-mindedly on their phones, oblivious to the trap they had walked into. Howard Gable watched from the shadows near the equipment closet, his thin frame blending into the darkness. His heart raced, though not with fear or regret. What he felt was closer to anticipation, a cold, controlled thrill as he observed his targets assembling. They didn't know yet. They had no idea that their laughter, their derision, their cruel pranks had led them to this moment. He had rehearsed this in his mind for weeks, played out every possible scenario, and now the time had come to set his plan in motion. When the last student entered the gym, Howard slipped out of his hiding place and locked the heavy double doors behind him. The sound of the bolt sliding into place echoed loudly, causing a few of the students to glance up from their phones. Confusion flickered across their faces, but it quickly gave way to annoyance. They assumed it was some kind of technicality, perhaps a janitor locking up for the night. None of them noticed Howard yet, nor did they register the faint, acrid scent that began to permeate the air. Howard stepped forward, his movements deliberate and unnervingly calm. He was no longer the timid, stammering teacher they had mocked. He was something else entirely, something colder and more resolute. In one hand, he carried a small remote, the kind used to control a projector, though this one had been altered with crude wires and a switch. In the other he held a large metal chain, its links clinking softly with every step. He stopped at the center of the gym, standing beneath the harsh glare of the overhead lights. The students finally noticed him, their chatter dying down as they turned to look at the man who had once been their victim. The air grew thick with unease as Howard began his grim performance. He raised the remote and pressed a button, and the projector flickered to life, casting an image onto the large pull-down screen at the far end of the gym. It wasn't a lecture slide or a historical image, it was a video, one the students recognized instantly. It was the same video they had used to humiliate him. The grotesque caricature of his face, the mocking captions, the cruelly edited clips of his lectures. Laughter bubbled up from a few of the students, but it was nervous, unsure. The others watched in silence, a growing sense of dread settling over them, as they realized that this wasn't a history project. Howard let the video play for a few more seconds before pressing another button on the remote. The screen went dark, replaced by a single sentence scrawled in blood-red font, "This is your final lesson." The students exchanged uneasy glances, some whispering to one another, but no one dared move. Howard didn't speak. He didn't need to. Instead, he dropped the chain he was holding and walked to the edge of the gym, where he retrieved a large metal canister. He tipped it over, and a thick, dark liquid began to spill onto the floor, spreading in slow, viscous pools. The smell of gasoline filled the air, sharp and suffocating. Panic began to set in. One of the students, a tall boy with a cocky grin, stepped forward, his bravado faltering as he called out to Howard. But the teacher ignored him, continuing to pour the gasoline in a deliberate pattern, creating a crude perimeter around the students. By the time he was finished, the group was corralled into the center of the gym, their movements restricted by the spreading puddles of flammable liquid. Some of them tried to approach the doors, but they found them locked, the chains and padlocks gleaming ominously in the fluorescent light. Howard set the empty canister aside and reached into his pocket, pulling out a lighter. He held it up, the small flame flickering like a beacon of impending doom. The students froze, their terror palpable. The cocky boy made a move to rush him, but Howard was prepared. He pressed another button on the remote, and a hidden mechanism near the bleachers sprang to life. A trapdoor opened, releasing a hail of sharpened spikes that clattered to the ground in front of the advancing student. He stumbled backward, his face pale, his courage evaporating. The chaos began in earnest. Howard had designed the gym to be a maze of horrors, each corner rigged with a different trap. As the students scattered, trying to find an escape, they triggered tripwires that unleashed clouds of acrid smoke, blinding and choking them. Some stumbled into hidden snares made of razor wire, their screams echoing through the gym as the sharp metal bit into their skin. Others tried to climb the bleachers, only to find the steps coated in a slick, oily substance that sent them tumbling back down, bruised and bloodied. Howard watched it all with a cold detachment, his expression unreadable. He moved methodically, sealing off exits and herding the students back toward the center of the gym whenever they tried to scatter. He carried a nail-studded bat now, a crude weapon he had crafted in his workshop. When one of the students, a girl who had been among the loudest voices in mocking him, managed to reach the edge of the gasoline perimeter, he struck her down without hesitation. The sickening crack of the bat-meeting bone reverberated through the gym, silencing the others. The night stretched on, the gymnasium becoming a macabre theater of suffering. The air grew thick with the stench of blood, gasoline, and sweat. The students' screams faded into sobs, then silence, as their numbers dwindled. Some succumbed to the traps, while others were taken down by Howard himself, his movements precise and unrelenting. He didn't savor the violence, it was simply a means to an end, a necessary step in delivering his final lesson. By the time the last student fell, the gym was unrecognizable. The polished wooden floors were slick with blood, the bleachers splintered and broken. Howard stood in the center of the carnage, his bat hanging limply at his side. His breathing was shallow, his clothes soaked with sweat and flecked with crimson. He surveyed the scene, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and grim satisfaction. It was done. The lesson was complete. Howard retrieved the lighter from his pocket once more and flicked it open. He stared at the small flame, mesmerized by its dance, before lowering it to the edge of the gasoline-soaked floor. The fire roared to life instantly, a wall of orange and yellow that consumed everything in its path. He stood there for a moment, the heat searing his skin, before turning and walking toward the emergency exit. He had left it unlocked not for the students, but for himself. As the flames engulfed the gymnasium behind him, Howard stepped out into the cold desert night, disappearing into the shadows. The dawn after the massacre rose sluggishly over Red Mesa, Arizona, its light creeping hesitantly across the desert, as though reluctant to touch the horrors that had unfolded during the night. The gymnasium of Desert Pines High School was a smoldering husk, its once pristine walls charred black and sagging inward as plumes of acrid smoke twisted into the sky. The faint scent of burnt flesh lingered in the cool morning air, mingling with the sharper tang of scorched gasoline and melted plastic. Firefighters milled about, their soot-streaked faces etched with horror, while police cordoned off the area, their radios crackling with fragmented reports. The first to discover the scene had been a janitor arriving early to clean the school before classes began. He had smelled the smoke before he saw the devastation, the faint tendrils of it curling through the halls like ghostly fingers. When he unlocked the gym doors and stepped inside, the sight struck him like a physical blow. The bodies, or what remained of them, lay in grotesque disarray, their forms twisted and charred beyond recognition. Blood had seeped into the cracks of the gym floor, leaving dark stains that would never fully fade, even beneath layers of fresh varnish. The janitor stumbled back, clutching his chest, his knees buckling as he vomited onto the pavement outside. His screams echoed through the empty halls, drawing the attention of the first responders who would soon arrive. Word spread quickly, as it always did in a small town like Red Mesa. By mid-morning, the school grounds were surrounded by a growing crowd of parents, students, and townsfolk, their faces pale and drawn as they whispered among themselves. The police worked frantically to maintain order, but the questions came faster than they could answer. Who was responsible? Why had this happened? And where was Mr. Howard Gable? The teacher's absence hung over the scene like a dark cloud, the unanswered question that seemed to tie all the threads of horror together. Inside the school, the investigators worked methodically, their grim task unfolding under the harsh glare of portable floodlights. The gym was a crime scene, unlike any they had ever encountered, a tableau of violence and destruction that defied comprehension. The traps Howard had set were still partially intact, their cruel ingenuity horrifying even the most seasoned officers. Bloodied wires, shattered stakes, and crude chemical devices littered the floor, testaments to the meticulous planning that had gone into the massacre. Forensic teams collected what little evidence remained, their gloves stained red as they sifted through the ash and debris. Among the wreckage, they found the notebook Howard had left on his desk. It was surprisingly intact, the leather cover only slightly singed. Inside, the investigators discovered pages filled with his spidery handwriting, a chilling combination of meticulous planning and unhinged ramblings. The names of the victims were listed, each accompanied by detailed notes about their behavior, their insults, and their perceived betrayals. The final page bore only a single sentence: this was the only way they would learn. The discovery of the notebook confirmed what many had already suspected: Howard Gable had orchestrated the massacre. The quiet, unassuming teacher who had spent decades at Desert Pines High School, blending into the background, had become the town's most infamous killer. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Parents who had once trusted him to educate their children now spoke of him in hushed, fearful tones. Former colleagues, who had dismissed his oddities as harmless quirks, were racked with guilt, questioning whether they could have seen the signs and stopped him. The students who had survived, those who hadn't been part of the gymnasium's grisly scene, whispered among themselves, their faces pale and tear-streaked, as they pieced together the events that had led to the unthinkable. Howard Gable himself was nowhere to be found. The desert, vast and unforgiving, seemed to have swallowed him whole. The police conducted extensive searches, combing through the scrubland and rocky terrain with helicopters, dogs, and teams of volunteers. They found no trace of the man, only the faint impressions of footprints leading away from the gym and disappearing into the sand. Some speculated that he had perished in the wilderness, succumbing to dehydration or exposure. Others believed he had planned his escape as meticulously as the massacre itself and was hiding somewhere, watching the chaos he had unleashed. As the days turned into weeks, the town of Red Mesa began to fracture under the weight of its grief and fear. The families of the victims were inconsolable, their mourning interrupted only by the demands of the relentless media attention. News vans lined the streets, reporters jostling for interviews and sound bites as they painted Howard Gable as a symbol of the broken education system, a scapegoat for societal failure, or simply a monster in human form. Pundits debated his motives on national television, their detached analysis a stark contrast to the raw emotion gripping the town. At Desert Pines High School, the surviving students returned to find the building transformed into a mausoleum of their peers. The gym remained closed, its doors sealed with police tape, while the rest of the school struggled to return to some semblance of normalcy. But normalcy was impossible. Every hallway, every classroom, every desk was haunted by the memory of what had happened. The laughter that had once filled the halls was gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. The students who had mocked Howard Gable now spoke his name in hushed tones, their voices trembling with a mix of fear and guilt. The teachers fared no better. Many of them resigned, unable to face the ghost that lingered in the classrooms where they had once taught. Those who stayed found themselves under intense scrutiny, their every action questioned by parents who no longer trusted the school to protect their children. The administration implemented sweeping changes, installing new security systems and hiring counselors to address the trauma that had engulfed the student body. But no amount of cameras or therapy sessions could erase the scars left by that night. The town's collective unease was heightened by the occasional, chilling reminder that Howard Gable was still out there. Every so often, a strange report would surface, a figure spotted walking along the edge of the desert at dusk, or an anonymous note left on a teacher's desk, its handwriting eerily familiar. The notes were always cryptic, filled with vague, unsettling warnings about the cost of cruelty and the lessons yet to be taught. Some dismissed them as hoaxes, the work of teenagers seeking attention. Others believed they were proof that Gable was alive, watching and waiting. In the months that followed, the tragedy at Desert Pines High School became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of the consequences of unchecked cruelty and neglect. The town of Red Mesa would never fully recover. Its people carried the weight of what had happened like a permanent shadow, their lives irrevocably changed by the actions of a man they had overlooked for too long. And somewhere, far from the reach of the law or the judgment of his peers, Howard Gable watched, waiting for the day when he could deliver his final lesson. The story of the Desert Pines High School massacre lingered like a scar in the psyche of Red Mesa, a wound that refused to heal. In the months and years that followed, the town became a hushed epitaph for tragedy, its name whispered in classrooms and newsrooms alike, evoking images of terror and unanswered questions. The gymnasium, once the heart of school spirit, remained a blackened ruin, its reconstruction delayed by bureaucratic inertia and a superstitious reluctance to disturb the site. Eventually, it was quietly fenced off, left to rot under the desert sun, a decaying monument to the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. The town itself seemed to shrink, its population dwindling as families packed up and left, unwilling to endure the oppressive pall that hung over Red Mesa. The remaining residents lived in a perpetual state of vigilance, their children growing up under the shadow of fear. The name Howard Gable was etched into the collective consciousness like a curse, his actions transforming him into both a villain and a legend. To some, he was a deranged madman, a warning against the dangers of unchecked anger. To others, he was a ghost, a specter haunting the edges of the desert, waiting to strike again. The authorities never stopped searching for Gable, though their efforts became increasingly perfunctory as the years dragged on. The trails they followed always ended in dead ends, faint footprints swallowed by the desert sands, rumors of a drifter matching his description seen in nearby towns, and anonymous tips that led to nowhere. The manhunt became a grim ritual, repeated with diminishing hope. The desert, vast and unforgiving, seemed determined to keep its secrets. Forensic psychologists who studied Gable's actions tried to understand the depths of his madness. They pored over his notebooks, his emails, and his surviving records, attempting to piece together a portrait of a man who had walked a knife's edge between normalcy and depravity for decades. His meticulous planning, his unassuming demeanor, and his ability to vanish without a trace suggested a mind that was both brilliant and deeply fractured. The massacre was no act of impulsive rage, it was the culmination of a lifetime of suppressed humiliation and resentment, distilled into an act of cold, calculated vengeance. But Howard Gable had not vanished entirely. Though his physical presence remained elusive, his shadow continued to fall over those who had survived him. Teachers in neighboring schools began to receive unsettling messages, short, cryptic emails signed with the initials HG. These notes arrived without warning, their language chillingly precise. They spoke of lessons left unlearned, of cruelty festering beneath the surface, and of consequences yet to unfold. Some dismissed them as hoaxes, the work of disturbed individuals exploiting the notoriety of Gable's name. Others feared they were genuine, a sign that Gable was alive, watching, and waiting. One such message arrived at the desk of a high school principal in a town 100 miles away. The email was short but unmistakably menacing a classroom as a crucible. Test its contents too harshly, and it will shatter. Are your students learning? Attached was a photograph of a deserted school hallway, the fluorescent lights casting stark shadows against the lockers. The principal immediately contacted the police, but the investigation yielded nothing. The email had been sent from an untraceable account, its origins buried behind layers of encryption. Rumors spread quickly, fueled by the media and the internet's insatiable appetite for sensationalism. Stories of strange sightings proliferated: an elderly man walking along a desolate highway, a shadowy figure lurking near a school fence, a weathered notebook found in an abandoned building, its pages filled with scrawled accusations and ominous warnings. Each sighting added another layer to the myth of Howard Gable, transforming him into a figure of folklore, a cautionary tale whispered to children who dared to bully their peers. Be careful, parents warned. You never know who's watching. For those who had survived the massacre, the weight of what they had witnessed became a lifelong burden. Survivors' guilt gnawed at them, their memories haunted by the faces of their classmates and the horrors they had endured. Therapy sessions became a grim routine, but no amount of counseling could erase the images burned into their minds: the smell of gasoline, the sound of screams, the cold, detached expression on Howard's face as he carried out his plan. Some turned to activism, campaigning against bullying in schools and advocating for better mental health support. Others withdrew from the world entirely, unable to face the memories that surfaced every time they closed their eyes. Howard's former colleagues fared no better. Many of them left the profession altogether, their faith in the educational system shattered. Those who stayed behind found themselves under constant scrutiny, their every decision questioned by parents and administrators alike. The tragedy had become a mirror, reflecting the failures of a system that had ignored the warning signs and allowed a man like Gable to slip through the cracks. But the truth was more complicated. Howard Gable had been invisible, not because no one had noticed him, but because no one had cared to look. In the years that followed, the massacre inspired a wave of copycat threats and attacks, each one invoking Gable's name as a twisted symbol of retribution. Schools across the country tightened their security, installing metal detectors, hiring armed guards, and implementing zero-tolerance policies for bullying. But these measures did little to address the underlying issues. The culture of cruelty that had fueled Gable's rage continued to thrive, hidden behind the polished facade of classrooms and school assemblies. And somewhere, in the shadows of an uncaring world, Howard Gable waited, his name whispered like a curse, his presence felt in every anxious glance and locked door. The final chapter of the story came years later, though it provided no closure. A hiker exploring a remote stretch of the Arizona desert stumbled upon a dilapidated shack half buried in the sand. Inside, he found the remnants of a life abandoned: a cot covered in tattered blankets, empty cans of food, and a stack of notebooks filled with dense, erratic handwriting. The notes spoke of regret and justification, of a desire for revenge tempered by a deep, gnawing loneliness. They ended abruptly, the final page bearing only a single line: the desert remembers, even if they forget. Nearby, the hiker found a shallow grave marked by a crude wooden cross. Beneath it lay skeletal remains, bleached white by the sun. Forensic tests confirmed what the world had already suspected: the bones belonged to Howard Gable. The discovery brought no relief to Red Mesa. The man who had haunted their nightmares was gone, but his legacy remained, a dark shadow that would never fully fade. Even in death, Howard Gable had the last word, his actions a permanent reminder of the cost of indifference and the fragility of the human soul.